Good morning, all. Alicia's here. Autumn is here. I'm running a couple of minutes late. Not too bad for Monday morning, but good morning. This is Monday, July 22nd, 2024. And good morning. All right. Grand Rising. Nice. I like that. Alicia, I'm not, and I hope I'm saying your name correctly. I'm not sure that we've met in person. Uh,
I don't think we have. I work during the week, so I'm at work now. So I wanted to be sure I
okay.
got on for the Zoom call.
Okay.
Yes,
All
ma'am.
right. All right, very good. All right, and Autumn, I know we've met, and I know that Autumn, I think is at work also. So, yeah, anytime either one of you need to jump off, I understand that completely. So, and then this will be uploaded to the Facebook videos soon. Billy does that for us, our virtual assistant, Kristen's virtual assistant, and he does a lot of work for us here. So this will, so good morning to everyone. We don't have a way of designating this anymore on Facebook when it gets uploaded. Today is supposed to be the miscellaneous documents, which it will be. And because what I thought I would do this morning, we have just been last week given the training versions of the new forms that we're going to be using over the next, starting to use over the next couple of weeks. And so I thought I would go over some of the changes in that. The two of you here this morning joining me, the great thing about you all of you brand new agents is that you don't have any bad habits to break. And so when I talk about the change in the forms, you're probably not that familiar with our forms to begin with. And so you might not realize that these are some changes. The changes that are made on the forms are rather significant changes. The way that we sell real estate truly has not changed all that much. If you've been doing things, and I know all of you have been trained to do things the right way. So just a little bit of background here. If you've been listening to the Tuesday morning business meetings, you've heard David and Lynn Weymouth, our supervising broker, talking about the lawsuits and some of the changes that our industry is seeing because of the lawsuits. The lawsuits are all about, just a real thumbnail, and I'm very simplifying things here, are about sellers that didn't understand or disagreed with paying additional compensation, what they felt was additional compensation to the buyer's agent or the licensee assisting the buyer on the other side of the transaction. And um, it's been pointed out to me by some of my former students that if everyone had been doing things the way that they were supposed to be, the way that I teach people to do in my classes, and I know you all have been taught to do in launch, that it's really not going to affect what we do because we've been doing things the right way all along. The lawsuits were truly, and what it boils down to is that then the National Association of Realtors came to a settlement with these class action lawsuits and said, okay, we'll be changing some of the ways that we do some things here. And so it's all really about transparency. Who is paying who? Who's representing who? We've been dealing for 30 years now with Kansas and Missouri when they adopted the broker disclosure forms and kind of saw that buyer agency was coming in because that was a new thing 30 years ago. There was no such thing as buyer agency prior to that. About who's representing who. And now we are to the point where, well, who's paying who? The compensation. We all hope and expect to get compensated for the work that we do. We all do a lot of very important things. We all work very hard. Most of the time, the hardest part of our job is keeping a transaction together. And if buyers and sellers truly understand that, truly understood what everything we do back behind the scenes, that we don't necessarily, make a big deal about. And I've got someone joining me here in person this morning. All right, Olgie's here. All right. All right. So I'll give her a few minutes to get settled up before I start sharing things, but that was remind me all. Everyone give me just a second here so that I can cast to our room. Second here. Okay. All right, there we go. And now I'm back on Zoom. All right, and so it's all about transparency. So we have some new forms and we have some changes in forms. And again, for all of you new people that haven't really been working with our forms yet, the changes, you're not going to be really familiar with that. But I thought that this would be a good opportunity for me to go over and these are just the training, what you'll see when I pull these up, that these are just the training version of these. There may still be some changes coming before we actually start using them at the end of this month. All changes have to be made and put into place by August 14th. So that's when we'll see a couple of changes in MLS. If you've had an opportunity to get on and play with MLS, and you'll see some changes there. The biggest change there, I believe, is going to be, we'll still have the disclosure of how we're representing our sellers, assuming that we're the inputting agents on our listings. So we'll still have that, because all of that is still the same, that we will be designating who is representing who on our contract. Kansas license law and Missouri license law both require that. The biggest change on our contract or on our listings, as they show up in MLS, is we will no longer have the field that shows how much the licensee assisting the buyer will be compensated. That will go away. And, while they're doing these things, they may make some other changes too. I don't know. I'm not privy to that information. So today we're going to be going over the new forms. And I just pulled those up this morning. I've looked at them. I shouldn't try to give that. I looked at them last week when they came through. I just pulled them up on my computer this morning to put so that I have access to them. So I'm going to be probably kind of fumbling around here just a little bit, because I didn't put them in the order that I really would have preferred them to be in. First thing, I'm going to show a oh, here we go. It did. All right. All right. So I'm casting in here, and now I will share my screen to those of you. Zoom here with me. All right. So here is just the listing contract amendment for NAR settlement. That's not what I intended to pull up. So hold on just a second. This is what I intended to pull up. Our forms impacting, so the changes in the form. So this is a list that we got. I'm sure that we will upload this. We will probably upload this into our KW and KC templates on .loop, and probably KCRAR will probably also, I need that to go away. Upload those into the forms, KCRAR templates as well. But I thought we would go over this overview of the new forms and the changing of the forms here. So I'll make that a little bit bigger so everyone can see it. So our forms impacting our buyers. There are now 3 types of agency relationships. There always have been. And so, but they will be coming more into our world. But these have always been there. You probably learned about them in your pre-license class, but they will be coming more and more important as to how you are, if you are representing a buyer. I need to make one thing perfectly clear. One thing that NAR, KCRAR, and our brokerage all feel strongly about is that before you show any property to a buyer, and I'm going to step aside here and say open houses do not count as showings. That has been well established. an open house, I'm going to repeat that. An open house does not count as a showing. So, but anytime you're going to be showing a property, you really, really should have some kind of agreement signed with the buyer. And it should be one of these three that are listed here. Three types of agency relationships: an exclusive buyer agency. Say that now that's what most of you have been doing with most of us have been doing with most of our buyers anyway over the years, with a few exceptions of that. And so now we have an updated form of that, which we'll get to here pretty soon. You can also be a non-exclusive buyer agent. I would not recommend that ever. Nothing about that has changed. Non-exclusive buyer agency, going back to your pre-license classes, non-exclusive means that that buyer has signed an agreement with more than one broker, possibly, but more importantly, has retained the right to find their own property and not pay any commission. So a non-exclusive buyer agency has always been legal, has always been legitimate. My suggestion to you is, why would you want to do that? The buyers are, buyers do cost us a lot of time, money, and energy. And probably, when it's an exclusive buyer agency agreement, it probably pays off. But even with an exclusive buyer agency agreement, you're taking a chance that you're not going to be the agent that procures the property with the terms and agreements agreeable to the buyer, because that's our agency agreement, what our job is. That just describes what our job is for that buyer. You may not be the one that does it within the time frame of your buyer agency agreement, and they may move on. They may quit looking for properties. They at the end of our agency agreement, they may move on to another broker, and there's nothing we can do about that. So we are always taking a little bit of a chance that we're not going to get paid for working for them anyway. On a non-exclusive buyer agency, you are just increasing that chance tenfold, if not 100-fold. They're working with another broker. They're out looking for sell by owners, sell by themselves, and they don't have to tell you what they're doing. And if they are the ones responsible, or another broker is the one responsible for procuring that property at the terms and conditions agreeable to them, then you don't get a commission. And so why would you want to do that? But it's still legal and legitimate. All right, so then the limited services transaction broker. We've always been able to work as a transaction broker. Again, just a reminder for all of you, transaction broker means that within the transaction, we are not representing either party. Most of the time, you're representing either the seller or the buyer, but there are those occasions when we're not representing either party. Once again, this has been legal and legitimate in both Kansas and Missouri for many, 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 many years. We are now probably going to start using that a little bit more than we ever have before. And also one of the other updates to that is that it's now called a limited services agent. In transaction brokerage, we are very limited what we can say and do. And here's again, transparency on both sides for buyers and sellers. If you are working with someone as their agent, you owe them those fiduciary duties. Once again, you learned those things in your pre-license class. And I called it cold AC. You might have learned it as old car, but I call it cold AC. Care, obedience, loyalty, disclosure. That's the cold part. The care is your skill and knowledge, your negotiation help. Those are things that we owe our clients. The A and the C I like to keep out separate because that's accountability and confidentiality. And I like to keep those separate because they never, ever, 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 ever go away, right? We're always accountable for our actions, for money and property. And anything that we learn in confidence about the seller or buyer, we can never disclose that until it's made public by them. All right, so those fiduciary duties are only due to people that we have an agency agreement with. I know that some of you out there, and I've done it myself. So I'm not, saying that it's terrible. It is terrible, but I've done it myself. You're out there showing properties to buyers that you don't have an agency agreement with, and you are saying things that you shouldn't be saying. You are saying things like, "Oh my gosh, it looks to me like that roof probably needs to be replaced." Or, I don't think that, this seems really high priced for this neighborhood. I'm not sure that they can justify this price in this neighborhood. Those are things that we should not ever, 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 those are types of things that we should not ever say to anyone that we don't have an agency agreement with. And we've all done it, but just don't do it now. All right. It's more important now than ever before not to. So the limited service transaction broker, all of those things remain in place. And when we get to that form, we'll talk about things that we can and cannot do when we're working as a limited service or transaction broker. One of the things is we can't ever give an advantage to one of the parties over the other party. We can never divulge. Now, there are certain things that we do have to disclose. We have to disclose any material fact about the property that might change the buyer's mind about buying it. Anything that might affect the marketability of a title, we have to disclose all of those things to all parties and regardless of how we're working with them. But non-disclosure is one of those real key, or I'm sorry, not confidentiality is one of those real key things about limited service transaction broker. So we'll get in more into the details of that. Changes made to the exclusive buyer's agency and non-exclusive buyer's agency contract. They've removed any reference to compensation in MLS because that's going to go away. We are no longer going to have that field in MLS telling us what the seller is willing, or actually what the listing broker was willing to compensate the licensee assisting the seller. So that's going away. And they've added compensation not set by law negotiable. So once again, part of what this full settlement about was transparency. And again, this is not a change. You would have learned this in your pre-license class too, that all compensation between a seller and a broker, between a buyer and a broker, has always been negotiable. No one sets what a broker is going to charge other than the broker's office policy, right? And there's, again, legal and legitimate there. Always negotiable between the parties. The third bullet point there, new compensation of buyer's agent cannot exceed what is in the buyer's agency. So in our buyer's agency, and we've talked about this in our buyer agency classes, is that you set what you are going to get paid, what you expect to get paid. It's always been worded fairly loosely in our buyer's agency that we will get whatever MLS offers, or what is ever offered through MLS, or a set amount, whichever one of those is greater. It's always been, if you've listened to my classes before, it's always been kind of my recommendation that you think about that carefully. I always typically put 2% in there, even though most of what we were being offered was 3%. I always put 2% in there because, there were always those listings that had less than 3% listed what the compensation split was going to be. So on this line in the buyer's agency, think very carefully about that, because you cannot receive more than your buyer's agency compensation says you will. Can we change that? Of course we can. Everything can be changed. But so now Linda's verbiage is, probably changed. I probably am going to put 3% in there now. Become a little clearer when we get to that, because then again, it's probably easier to go down than it is to go up. All right. And then we're also under that third bullet point there's another thing new added to our buyer agency agreement, that the option to add a retainer additional compensation. And we have an addendum for that, one of the forms that we're going to be going over this morning. And then the fourth bullet point, new buyer representations for a written agreement required. See, we have to have some kind of written agreement, an agency agreement, whether it's exclusive or non-exclusive, or a transaction broker. That's considered to be an agreement. It's not agency, but it's an agreement. Sixth bullet point, paragraph 6E, buyer shall be released and relieved of any obligation to pay the broker's fees described herein if through no fault on the part of the buyer, the seller fails to disclose the transaction. If such transaction fails to disclose because of any breach of the sales contract on the part of buyer, broker's fees will not be waived, but will be due and payable by the buyer immediately. All right, here we go. A lot of legalese there, but what it's saying is, if we're under contract, if our buyer goes under contract and we have worked out our compensation, If the seller is the one that breaches the contract between the buyer and the seller, for some reason doesn't go to closing, then the buyer does not owe us any compensation. If it's the seller that breaches the contract, the buyer doesn't owe us any compensation. If it is the buyer that breaches the contract, we are still expecting our compensation because we did our job, right? We procured a property. If they went under contract, that means we did our job. And then we have our new form, our limited services transaction broker. And the explanation for that is printed here. Agents expecting compensation are to enter into, at a minimum, a transaction broker relationship. The limited services agreement provides for a third option. Buyer understands the limited services arrangement between buyer and broker, but compensation is clearly defined and matches that of the exclusive and non-exclusive agreements. So we'll get to that. We're just looking at the overview here. Buyer agency contract amendment. This is a brand new form. We will use this form. I don't think it applies to anyone that I've got here in person with me or on Zoom with me, but some of you that are listening to this later on Facebook, this may apply to you. If you are currently under an exclusive buyer agency agreement or a non-exclusive, because it is available to you, but I haven't seen any come through. If you are currently under an agency agreement with a buyer, we will have this amendment ready for you to have signed before the 14th of August, before everything changes. I'm really thinking that we're going to start using this in the next couple of weeks just to make sure that these things are in place. And the change that it makes is here that because of the shared compensation, and our buyer agency agreement currently still talks about what's going to be shared through MLS, through our cooperation with the listing broker. So our amendment will amend that paragraph, and we'll get to that here shortly. Another brand new form that we have coming in will be the retainer additional compensation. The brand new form, never used anything like this ever before and this is going to be for on the buyer side, that we might collect from them some money up front. It could be your $4.95. It could be some money, because again, we put in a lot of time, money, and effort on a buyer. You know, that they're using part of our, you know, MLS expertise. We're showing them properties, so we're using gas and our time. So this allows for collecting some money up front. And anything that we would charge over what our agency agreement or agreement, buyer agreement shows that we are expecting to be paid the $4.95 plus 3% or whatever. All right, some of the changes that have been made on our purchase agreements, our sales contracts. First bullet point, with the removal of shared compensation from MLS, buyers have the option to ask that the broker assisting them be paid by the seller. That will now be baked into our contract. If you're writing a contract on a property between now and the time we actually start using that contract, and that may wait until the 14th because we're expecting everyone in MLS KCRAR to start using it at the same time. We'll have our drop dead date given to us here pretty soon, so we'll know when everyone's supposed to start using them. But it's going to be baked into our contract. We will talk about that today briefly because I want you to have the correct verbiage to put into an existing, the current sales contract in case you run across the situation where currently MLS says that the seller's not compensating the buyer broker, licensee assisting the broker or assisting the buyer, that you know how to write it into your contract because it's perfectly acceptable to do that. And we are running across some of those listings now. Not many, I will say, but we are running across some of them. Our second bullet point, our purchase agreement will also show third-party beneficiary language added due to new compensation provision. Third party, that's us. We're a third party we're a beneficiary now to the contract. Well, I've always said before that the contract is an agreement between the buyer and the seller, which it still is, but we are now considered a beneficiary of something that happens within that contract. We're still not a party to it, but we're a beneficiary of it. And third bullet point, seller's compensation of broker assisting buyers added to the seller expenses. So we'll get to that. Fourth bullet point, compensation not set by law and negotiable. That will now be put into all of our agreements, whether it's a buyer agencies, listing agreement and or contract, making clear to everyone, again, that transparency, that compensation is and always has been negotiable and not set by law or any other rule or regulation. Broker's office policy is the only thing that sets that, and it's negotiable between the parties. The next bullet point, brokers are acting pursuant to separate agency agreements, right? So because we have an agreement with the seller, agreement with the buyer. Same changes were made to land and new home contracts. That any of you out there working with that, new homes is probably the one that you would be using more often than the land. Although they've been giving us the line numbers here, I haven't been reading them. The line number is going to be different because those contracts are worded differently, and all of the line numbers are different. But so if you are working with land or new homes, make sure that you talk with me or with Kristen or with Lynn about all of that, because some of the changes are being reflected in here. So we need to make sure that you know where they are. And then our counteroffer addendum has been updated to include the buyer broker compensation as well. We'll probably get to that today too. 2 hours, I probably don't have enough time to get through all of the new forms, but I'm going to get through the ones that I think you will be using most often here in the next couple of weeks. We also have some changes and new forms to forms impacting our sellers. Our current exclusive right to sell says that brokers will cooperate and compensate was removed. The changes that are referenced here on this particular form that we're going over right now are on the KCRAR templates. We have our own templates for the buyer agency agreements and for the listing agreements, and our new forms will also reflect those changes. We may, for a short period of time, be using the KCRAR forms until we get our internal forms updated. So just kind of a heads up there. There may come a point when I tell you, I know you need to be using the KCRAR forms, and then, a few weeks later, I'll be telling you, I know you need to be using our internal forms. Paragraph 9 is a consent and clarification for the ways a broker may operate. Description was simplified. Always thought that it should have been to begin with, but we have to do what the lawyers tell us to. So we'll get that in our listing agreement here. New thing that was added in our listing agreement, compensation not set by law, and it's negotiable. Again, that's going to be added to all of our forms, all of our agreements that deal with compensation. Next bullet point, compensation for listing brokers expressly defined. So again, for the listing broker, what we are charging as the listing broker. All right, we'll get to that when we get to the listing agreement. The protection period paragraph is not changed, but it was named. All right, see, they just made, hey, they thought this was a good time to make some just general changes to some of the forms. For the protection period, remember that's the period of time after our listing agreement expires. It also pertains to our buyer agency agreement, but that expires, that protects us if that seller decides to start working with a buyer to whom we introduce the property. It protects our compensation there. It's always been there. There's a blank in the one that we use right now with the default of 90 days behind it, or maybe it might just be printed as 90 days. It used to have a default, but I think now it might be printed 90 days. What that means is if you find out that your seller is now working after our listing agreement expires, is now working with a buyer to whom you introduced the property. They came through an open house and or they, sign call, or you introduced them to the property, you are still due your compensation. There are a couple of hoops that we have to jump through for that to come into play. Number one, we have to name those buyers. Before the listing expires, you have to give a list of names to the seller, saying these are the people that I introduced to the property. If they come back, and here's the conversation you have to have, clarify to the seller what all of this means. If they approach you after the listing expires, they no longer see my sign in the yard, then and then want to purchase the house from you to save the commission, you will still owe me the commission. So make sure that the seller understands that, and especially, I mean, again, all of you, transparency, clarification has always been priority for me. You should never, ever, ever, ever just give any document to anyone and just expect them to sign it. You should always be explaining what they say. And again, I think it's quite legitimate and acceptable for you to have a cheat sheet. And in front of them, even with your cheat sheet, out beside each paragraph of the listing agreement, just put your little thumbnail explanation of what that paragraph's for. And that, because nobody reads those, well, I shouldn't say nobody does. There are certain personalities that read them. You should. I truly, truly, truly expect you to read these to understand them. Because there's nothing worse than a buyer or seller asking you a question that is specifically referenced and where the answer is specifically referenced in our listing agreement, and you are, number one, not aware of that, or number two, you're fumbling around trying to find it. So no one expects you to memorize these forms. The forms change often enough that nobody can do that. I don't have them memorized, but I can pretty much tell everybody what paragraph references that answer that they need, or when I'm talking with the buyer or seller, I do explain to them all of the obligations that are listed out for the buyer on the buyer agency. I should talk about the listing agreement since we're here and the listing agreements here, but all of the obligations of the seller, all of the obligations of the broker, and how the compensation works. So use those cheat sheets to your advantage and use them in front of the people. You know, that there's nothing wrong with that. All right, so our protected, the other hoop that we have to jump through on our protected period is, so number one, you have to have provided before the listing expires, provided to the seller a list of the names of the buyers that you want protected by that. And then the second hoop is, it's not really a hoop, if they list with another broker, our protection period goes away and is no longer in effect. So if they just decide, well, you didn't do what you were supposed to do, you didn't sell my house, so I'm going to go list with a, Compass agent, then our protective period goes away, which, I think is fair. If I wasn't able to do, it was either because that, I couldn't get the seller to do what they were supposed to do, or I wasn't able to do what I was supposed to do. Either way, all right, move on, and I'm fine with that. The protective period, once again, even though it is all worded, because the agreement is between the seller and the broker, it's all worded that the broker, has the right to pursue. It's not going to be your broker that pursues that. It's going to be you. You're the one. And that's the question that I always ask Lynn in front of new agents. I would usually pull her in and throughout my class and say, hey, Lynn, what do you want us to put in that protected period clause? And she would say, I don't care. How long do you want to chase them down? And so, that's really it. That's if you happen to drive by the house and you see them moving, then there, you might try to have a conversation with that seller and see what happens. So, all right, moving on. Second to last bullet point here, the title insurance paragraph, there are no changes in that, because remember, that is the one of the obligations of the seller. We do expect here in the Kansas City market for the seller to pay for the title insurance. That's not the case elsewhere across the country. Some of you that might be familiar with contracts outside of the Kansas City area, it's not always the seller that has to pay it, and everything's negotiable in a contract, but our contract does say that the seller would be paying it, but it was moved within our contract. So see, that's what they did to me. They changed that. The biggest change for me is this, because, as I said, nothing really changed in the way we're supposed to be selling real estate, but they changed the line numbers on me when I did have some of the line numbers memorized. So, working with you all. And then the last bullet point, same changes were made to the exclusive agency and exclusive right to sell transaction broker. However, the line numbers differ. So again, they always been legal and legitimate to have an exclusive agency agreement as opposed to an exclusive right to sell. And again, why would you want to do that? But it's always been legal and legitimate to do it. This is a new form, though, the exclusive right to sell transaction broker. that's been a little harder for us to kind of hammer down on here, but we do have the ability to take a listing and not represent the seller. It does clarify our compensation, which once again is the purpose behind most of these documents here. They've made some changes to the estimated proceeds because now we have a distinct line item for the buyer broker compensation. And that's the KCRAR form. If you use our internal forms, and I'd like to think that David was looking years ahead on this, because on our internal forms, the one that David Conderman has in an Excel spreadsheet for us, has always had the licensee assisting the buyer compensation as a separate line item. So if you've been using our form, there's no reason for you to ever change that. If you're using the KCRAR forms, it has been separated out. Our listing contract amendment, and so once again, this is our listing agreement between the broker and the seller. If you currently have one in place or put one in place before all of these changes absolutely go into effect, this is a clarification amendment about the compensation. So we'll get to that here probably in the next hour. Miscellaneous changes, additional disclosures, line 76, 77, and 79, 80, sources of compensation match their purchase agreements. Seller's permission to show. Oh, what's the seller's permission to show? That's when we have a for sale by owner. When we are looking at properties that are not listed through MLS, through our cooperation agreement with other brokers, seller's permission to show actually does indicate that we don't have an agency agreement. We will not be representing the seller, and the compensation. We have to get that all worked out. So seller's permission to show, just as a reminder for all of you, because that's one of those miscellaneous forms I hadn't gone over in a while. It probably would have been on my list today if I weren't doing all of these changes. But seller's permission to show, we have to have the signature of all owners of record before we can show any property that's not listed through MLS or that we don't have an agency agreement or listing agreement with. I'm going to repeat that. We have to have the signatures of all owners of record. So if you are out with a buyer on a Saturday afternoon and you're in a neighborhood that they like, and there's a for sale by owner sign there, and they'll say, oh, can we see that one? Your answer should probably be, well, probably not today, because I have to get permission to show that. I have to get it signed by all owners of record, and I have to see if they're going to be paying me, or if our agreement and our buyer agency is going to kick in here. So you have to. So you can't just go and knock on the door and have the person that answers the door sign it, assuming that they would be one of the owners of record. If a teenager answers the door, you certainly can't do that. So all owners of record, you have to do a little bit of research. You have to make an appointment on these situations, and they do come up, folks. They really do. And as we start to see some more, well, I'm not even going to say that, but you will see for sale by owners. We always have. They've always been out there. So this situation will come up to you. My preference, the way I would do it, is knowing I have to get that signature anyway. I'll call the number on the sign, make the appointment, tell them that I do have buyers. Never, ever, ever lie to anybody. But if I do have buyers that want to see that property, I certainly make that point. Tell them that they love the neighborhood, or whatever. But I have buyers that would like to see the property. I need to get your permission, your written permission to show the property. Plus, I would like to familiarize myself with the property. Could I come by tomorrow afternoon about 3 o'clock and look at your property? A lot of times they'll say, well, we're holding it open tomorrow, come by then. If you're going to show it to a buyer, you still need to don't just go through the open house. You still need that permission to show, because you need that compensation agreement too. And so we will talk about that here pretty soon. And that's the end of our list there. All right. So, and still some time before break. All right. So that's the overview of the forms. Let's talk about our exclusive buyer agency. And yes, I will still continue to do this. We'll go over this a little more in detail on Wednesday, because today is miscellaneous documents. Wednesday is buyer agency and listing agreements. But some of the things there might take a little more than 2 hours if we're going over that completely, because I'm doing that just like I do every month on the buyer agency agreement. I just want to hit on those changes in our overview there. Okay, term of agreement hasn't changed. Some of these things just look just a little bit different here. The buyer's representation, we are again making sure that they don't have any kind of written agreement here. They're not obligated to pay any other broker. Kind of like to make that point here. Broker's obligations didn't really change too much. We are still, and again, this is our exclusive buyer agency here. We are still performing the terms of the contract, exercising reasonable skill and care for the buyer, all of our agency duties there. And then we come down to the compensation here. So they've highlighted this for us. They have highlighted some of the other things up there too. It's not that I'm skipping over them, but we'll come back to them really on Wednesday. But compensation to broker. So buyer acknowledges there are no standard compensation rates, and the compensation in this agreement is fully negotiable and not set by law. I'm going to make that just a little bigger here. Get rid of that. Okay. And move this around a little bit. All right, brokers shall be entitled to compensation for assisting in negotiating in the procurement of property acceptable to buyer. Broker's compensation shall be, and we have 2 boxes to check here. Check one of them. Line 80, the amount the compensation will be. And this is where you can, again, all negotiable. You can put a flat fee here. We've always been able to do that, a flat fee, or a percentage of the sales price. And that's how that needs to be worded. 3% of the sales price. And, actually I should have checked with Lynn on this, but before I say it, it should be probably either gross or net. And here I would say, of the gross sales price. When we get to net sales price, and here's why, and it's not for greediness purposes, but when we get to net, we can have some disagreement on what the net includes. It's always kind of been that the net was whatever was agreed to in the agreement that the seller's paying in compensation in a buyer's closing costs. And so now it's going to be, the entire sales price. So we may bump up a little bit because of if we're asking the seller to pay our compensation. We may bump it up a little bit because the seller is paying for some of the buyer's closing costs. And it just makes things cleaner and clearer. And quite honestly, it doesn't make that much difference. Certain things that you'll read, it's like, well, agents ask for that because it means more money for them. Well, yeah, maybe $50, and not that $50 isn't a big bad bunch of money. I mean, if I saw $50 laying on the sidewalk, I'd certainly go to the trouble to pick it up. But in the big scheme of things, it's not that much. There may be some kickback to that. And again, I should have talked to Lynn before I actually brought that up. So, and then the second box on line 82, any other compensation. This is where we would also put our $495, I believe. So one or the other or both of these, but then this could also be any retainer that you are, even though that's now in a separate agreement. That's what the other compensation was for in our original buyer agency agreement. And I didn't like to talk about it because I don't think that that's really something that most agents do, except things are going to change now, right? So any other compensation in our exclusive buyer agency agreement, I still don't think it's really going to apply too much. So the amount of the compensation, a flat fee, or the percentage of the sales price plus the $495. Then on line 84, buyer may seek an agreement from the seller to pay the broker up to this compensation amount. Buyer is responsible for payment of any compensation not covered by the seller, or buyer will forego the purchase of said property. So here we go. We're still saying that if we receive compensation from any other source, buyer, we will subtract that from what we say you owe us here. But and then the second part of that, if buyer, any compensation not covered by the seller or a buyer will forego the purchase of said property. If we can't get payment from any party and the buyer won't pay us, then the buyer shouldn't buy that property. It's what that's all about. Buyer understands and agrees the broker may be compensated by more than one party in any transaction. However, broker is prohibited from receiving compensation for brokerage services that exceed the amount of compensation in this agreement. Buyer hereby authorizes the party handling the closing to pay compensation to broker from buyer's funds at closing if applicable. If the buyer's going to be paying us and we're not getting any money from the seller, or we're getting some of our money from the buyer, that it will come out at closing. We will be compensated at closing. No separate outside agreements. There is basically what that says. That we can be compensated by more than one party, and that all of this is in bold. I'm assuming it's still going to be in bold in our final version of this. And if our agreement here says, if we say 2.5% that we're asking the buyer to pay here, which we may do to try to make things easy for them, 2 or 2.5%, that then means that we can't accept 3% from the seller. Can we amend that by amending this exclusive buyer agency agreement? Of course we can. Okay, a couple of more minutes here. And here's our retainer additional compensation addendum is attached. We've never had this before because that's a brand new form. We've never had an attachment to our buyer agency agreement before, but that's what this is on line 94. The retainer, if we are charging extra money or upfront money, then we would check this box. And again, we've never had it before. It may come into play here. We will talk about those kinds of situations kind of as this entire scenario unfolds for us here as we are making these changes. Changes in paragraph F, buyers shall be released and relieved of any obligation to pay the broker's fee described herein if through no fault of the part of the buyer, the seller fails to close the transaction. If such transaction fails to close because any breach of the sale contract on the part of the buyer, broker's fees will not be waived, but will be due and payable by the buyer immediately. So if it's to closing, we are authorizing the closing agent to pay us from the buyer's funds there. However, and we talked about this paragraph on the overview document. If the seller breaches the contract and doesn't get to closing, we don't expect compensation by the buyer. If the buyer breaches the contract, now let's clarify that. Once again, our contract allows the buyer a legitimate reason to back out if they can't get the loan, if there are unacceptable conditions found in their inspections, if we can't renegotiate repairs, if we can't renegotiate a low appraisal. There's several times in there where the buyer and or seller can legitimately cancel the contract. We're not talking about canceling the contract. We're talking about breaching the contract. If either party just decides, they got cold feet, buyer decided they're paying too much money, whatever. A breach of the contract by the buyer, we still expect compensation. Breach of the contract by the seller, we don't, because the buyer doesn't have any control over that. Everything else remaining pretty much the same here. No changes down here. Buyer consent to brokerage relationships. Buyer consents to the following brokers relationships. And again, I don't like to talk about this because this is the KCRIR form, which includes a lot of things that our brokerage does not. It doesn't allow some services that our brokerage doesn't offer. So in our internal forms, we remove those and there are no boxes for you to check. It's just that the buyer does agree to them. But we'll go over all of these since we are probably going to be using the KCRIR forms here for a while. So line 210, buyer consents to buyer agency. You will not be practicing buyer agency. The only people in our brokerage that are allowed to offer buyer agency are David and Lynn, right? That is only available to supervising brokers and the broker of the brokerage. However, the brokerage does offer that service, so we would check this box, yes. Line 211, buyer consents to transaction broker and agrees if applicable to sign a transaction broker addendum. We've always said yes on that, so that remains yes, because you could work as a limited service or a transaction broker if the situation arises, right? We've got this buyer agency in place, but there may arise a situation where you have to become a transaction broker. Not going to get into the details of that. Just suffice it to say that if you are going to be showing a buyer that you have under buyer agency agreement, to a listing of yours that you have an exclusive right to sell agreement with, then go talk to a broker. Come talk to me, talk to Kristen, talk to Lynn, talk to David, talk to your coach, talk to someone, because that's a situation that has to be changed. You cannot show your listing to your buyer. All right, can't do it. All right. Line 213, buyer consents to dual agency and agrees if applicable to sign a disclosed dual agency agreement. That's only available. It's only legal to do that in Missouri. It is not available at this brokerage. Our brokerage does not offer the service of disclosed dual agency. I don't know of a broker in the Kansas City metro area that does, but they still put them in the forms because it is still legal in Missouri, just not something that you can do. So that would be a no on line 213. On line 215, buyer consents to designated agency. Absolutely. That's how you will be working 99.9% of the time. So that would be a yes. And then on line 217, buyer consents to the appointment of a designated agent for a seller and buyer's purchase of the property. Designated seller agent on the other side, if it's an in-house sale, that's a yes to on line 217. Again, our internal forms will not reflect the things that we don't offer. No other changes on this one. And we'll go over this again on Wednesday, but you are signing this on line 281 as the licensee assisting the buyer as the designated buyer's agent there. Brokerage name on line 278. KW in case the Kansas City Metro is how we would want that on there. Make sure that all buyers are signing it. Make sure that you have an address, a phone number, and or an email. All three would be great. Two of the three would be super. At one of the three at a minimum there. All right, and then that's it. All right, it's 2:50, or I'm sorry, where did that come from? It's 9:54. I will see you all in 10 minutes. We'll take a quick 10-minute break here. Was I not sharing that the whole time?
I don't know.
It was here, so I mean, it was showing up here. Oh gosh, I might not have been. I'll probably. No one said anything. The only chat that I got was good morning or grand rising from Alicia. Oh, well, by going out on Facebook, I'll probably get started in those comments.
Right, no worries, hey, no one said anything, so.
Yeah,
I'll
that's
let you
right.
know.
That's right. I will apologize when I come back, but I didn't know. I didn't pay attention. See you in a few minutes.
Sounds good.
All right, so I was so thrown off because as I was signing off here, let me get back to my full view. No, I was sharing, yeah, because, so, as I got back to, as I was closing out there, so I apologize to everyone, as I was closing out there, I thought maybe I wasn't sharing, but then I was, and so you probably heard that entire conversation, going on, but it does look like I was sharing, so, if I wasn't, I apologize for those of you that are on Facebook, um, later on, but no one said anything. So Autumn nor Alicia said anything about not being able to see anything. So, all right, so we finished up then with the buyer agency. Excuse me. And it is showing up here on my screen as well. So finished up there. We will now talk about our exclusive right to sell. And the changes coming up to that. Again, we'll talk about this also again on Wednesday, but I wanted to hit the changes here to our exclusive right to sell in case any of you have been out there playing around with the forms, which I always encourage you to do anyway. Haven't said that yet this morning, but not only do we hope that and expect actually for you to be writing contracts, practice contracts, make sure that you are including me on any loop that you're working on there. Practice, go pick out a listing on MLS and pretend as if you are working with the buyer and showing that property, writing up all of the buyer agency agreements, writing up all of the contract agreements, the documents in the contract and the offer, all of that. We hope that you'll be doing that. Absolutely no reason for you not to be doing it on buyer agency agreements and listing agreements as well. And so if you've been out there playing around, I just do today want to hit the highlights of this. That's my goal today is to hit the highlights of all of these. Oh, they didn't highlight. Hold on. This is my training one. Oh, and on most of the others, they highlighted the changes here, but the biggest change in this one as we're going through our listing agreement are the compensation. We didn't really change anything about any of the. Hi, Laura. Laura Bell's here.
Today.
All right. Oh, that's okay. Laura, so she just found out it's today. So she's here for the second hour of our contracts class. All right. That's good.
Yeah.
Not a problem, Laura. Okay. So and just to catch her up, we got the training documents last week on the new forms that we're going to be using, the new forms that we're going to be using, as well as the updates to the existing forms that we have. So I'm just kind of showing those here as just a real quick overview. Again, assuming that most of the people watching this class, attending this class, watching this class have not really played around with our forms much, but you've written some. Yeah. So, all right. Okay. So we're in the first hour, I went over just kind of an overview of all of the changes that we'll see coming and the buyer agency agreement. Right now we're in the listing agreement. And so on line 283 here, paragraph number 9, here's our brokerage relationship. Seller consents to brokerage relationships and all of the same conversation that we just had in the buyer agency agreement. Since we will probably be using the KCRAR forms available in their templates until we get our own internal forms done. I want to go over this because usually we don't have this conversation. I just want to make sure that everyone understands. We only, in our internal forms, only include the services that our brokerage offers. The KCRAR forms include everything that is available in both states. Some of those things that our brokerage doesn't offer. So on line 285, again, seller consents to seller agency. You will not be working as a seller agent. You will always be a designated agent. Again, only people in our brokerage that can work as a seller's agent are David Conderman and Lynn Weymouth. And I doubt if either one of them are watching this morning, so, or at any time in the future. So that will always be a yes, however, because it is a service that our brokerage offers. So line 285 is a yes. Line 286, seller consents to transaction broker and agrees if applicable to sign a transaction broker addendum. Transaction brokerage is a service that our brokerage offers. So this would be a yes. Once again, you will rarely work as a transaction broker, but you sometimes could. The times that you would be in that situation is when you are not representing either party. If you have a limited service transaction broker agreement with a buyer, not working with them, not representing them, and you're showing them a for sale by owner, not representing them, all right? That would be a time that you would be a transaction broker. Another time that you could be a transaction broker would be what I said about buyer agency. If you have a buyer agency agreement and you have an exclusive right to sell agreement, you cannot show that buyer, your listing, because that's dual agency. It's illegal in the state of Kansas. Our brokerage does not offer that service, so you cannot do it. Anytime you would be doing that, you would be working illegally. So please, if you ever find yourself in that situation, and you can legitimately be put in that situation. Don't ever put yourself in that situation, but that situation can grow around you. So make sure you're talking with your coach, with your team lead, with Linda, with me, with Kristen, somebody. So because that can happen to you, or if you're not representing either party.
So, quick question.
Sure.
So it's legal in Missouri, but our brokerage doesn't allow.
Correct. So we pretend that it doesn't exist, right? And the reason being, and as I said about buyer agency, when we were in the buyer agency too, I don't know of any broker in Kansas City that allows it.
Okay, yeah.
It's just such a legal quagmire.
Yeah, it's not a good position to put yourself in.
Exactly. It is not a position to put yourself in. So and in that situation, in the situation where your buyer, your listing, you have to either become a transaction broker or take yourself out of one of those situations. That's a whole conversation that we're not going to get into in this class. So that's why you talk to your team lead or to your coach or someone about that. 288, seller consents to sub-agency. Can I make this a little bit bigger? Consents to sub-agency. Again, sub-agency exists. I did make the comment to Lynn the other day. I'm kind of surprised that they still talk about it on these forums because, again, we don't offer it. Doesn't show up on our internal form. I don't know of a single broker in Kansas City that offers it. This used to be back in the dinosaur days when I first got my license. This is how we all sold real estate. But sub-agency really means that one broker is working for another broker who's working for the seller, and our buyer's unrepresented. So again, it's not going to show up on our form. This will always be a no. If I didn't make it clear, it is a no. Dual agency is absolutely no. No, I was talking about transaction broker. So sub-agency is always a no. When we get our own forms updated, our internal forms, it won't even show up, so don't worry about it. On line 289, seller consents to dual agency. Again, our brokerage does not offer that. So this will always be a no when you're using the KCRAR forms, won't even show up on our internal forms. On line 291, seller consents to the appointment of designated agent for the seller. Well, that would be you. So that will always be a yes. And on 293, seller consents to the appointment of a designated agent for the buyer and the seller's property. That will always be a yes also. Our sellers should allow a designated agents to sell their property. Again, the transparency, the clarification of all of this to your client. Yes, we want you to understand it, but we also want you to be able to explain it to your client. And there are going to be a lot of questions out there as this, if you've been out working with buyers and sellers or potential buyers and sellers, you've probably already fielded some of those. I know we have. A lot of people are reading the headlines, don't really understand what the lawsuits are all about. So you need to have a basic understanding of it. Again, listen to David's, the business meetings over the last couple of weeks. David's been talking about it over the last couple of months at the Tuesday morning business meetings, but we're talking about the forms and how it's really going to affect us, because now the rubber's really hitting the road here, because all of the changes have to be made by August 14th, excuse me. Allergies hit this weekend. And I forgot to take a bill this morning. All right. So on line 299, compensation to the listing broker. Seller agrees to pay listing broker compensation, which shall be. That is what we as our brokerage expect to receive from the seller. Different from our forms previously. What we as the listing broker expect to receive from the seller. Other compensation, again, may or may not show up for you. That would be the 495 really should be in the compensation line, but additional compensation would be if you are maybe collecting staging money from them, if you're collecting any of those other again, it gets tricky here just because of the wording on this form. So if you are ever going to be collecting any money from a seller or buyer other than the stated compensation commission rate or fee that you are charging them, talk to someone, talk to the broker, talk to your team lead, talk to your coach, whatever. So okay, and then going to go ahead and read this, even though we'll go over it again on Wednesday. The compensation shall be due and payable if listing broker or anyone else produces or finds a purchaser. Oh, and here it all boils down to, I love pointing out this sentence in all of our listing agreements, a ready, willing, and able buyer. When we provide a ready, willing, and able buyer, we have earned our commission. Ready and willing, it's pretty easy to do this. Anybody's that will write a contract. The able part is the more difficult part to prove. If we have a buyer that's getting a loan, that is when we have received a loan commitment letter from them. And I always, kind of find it funny because I think that's a term that nobody has ever heard, and it's right in our contract, and it's right. That's what proves that we have done our job. A loan commitment letter is a letter that we get from the lender that says the buyer's been qualified and the house has been qualified. The loan will be issued. And I would say 1 out of 200 agents actually bothers to get a loan commitment letter, but it's a very important part of our job. All right. A lot of times we don't have that, the commitment from the lender, whether it's in writing or not, until a day before closing, but RESPA, everybody remember RESPA says we're supposed to have that 3 days before. All buyers and sellers have to sign off if it's any sooner than 3 days before. All right. That's a little side thing Linda got off on. So, all right. So if we provide a purchaser ready, willing, and able to purchase property, the price and terms offered now, or the price and terms acceptable to the seller at a later date. The compensation is exclusively for listing broker services and is not subject to sharing, splitting, or otherwise paying to a buyer's broker. Seller may negotiate to cover some or all of a buyer's broker fees, which must be included in a separate contract, such as a real estate sales contract. That is all brand new verbiage for us in here. So I want to make sure that everyone does understand it. And it's probably, even as I've said, we may still see some last minute changes to some of these forms, but I really think that probably is the verbiage that we're going to stick with here on this particular one. All right, compensation is exclusively for the listing broker. So on line 300, that's what we will be keeping, right? And again, we have our broker's office policy. If you're on a team, you may have your team's policy. Always, always, always negotiable between the seller and the broker. So, I'm not going to say numbers in here because that can change. We'll talk about that in trainings and all of that, but not going to talk about that here because that is subject to change. Then we get to line 311, compensation to buyer's broker. Brand new in this form now, has never been in this form before. Compensation to buyer's broker, at least in this form. In addition to the compensation to the listing broker, a seller may agree, but is not required to pay the fees of a broker assisting a buyer. Seller acknowledges that any buyer's broker may represent the interest of buyer's only, not representing any of the seller's interests, right? And in fact, if someone, I don't want to use the word working against, but I can say negotiating against, right? So chances are that, and again, explain this to every seller. I am representing you, seller. I'm representing your best interest. All of my fiduciary duties are owed to you. I owe you all of those fiduciary duties. A buyer may be working with an agent for them. Again, all of those fiduciary duties. So they may negotiate. We don't, I'm not going to share any confidential information. There are certain things that I have to disclose. That's our limitation on confidentiality that we deal with here in this form, but make sure that the seller does understand that. However, seller, and this would, again, this is training stuff. This is not anything that's in our agreement here, but seller, for your property to be attractive to a buyer, and therefore that buyer's agent, we should probably talk about whether you are going to be compensating that buyer's agent. All right. And that's what subparagraph B is all about here. So not required to, but it is a marketing tool for us. All right. And chances are you're going to be asked to do it in the contract anyway, for most. So,
Yeah.
all right. All right. So on line 315, we have, again, 315 or 319, one of these has to be checked and only one here. So seller is willing to compensate broker assisting the buyer. And then on the next line, seller authorizes, or one of these two boxes has to be checked and only one, authorizes or does not authorize the listing broker to disclose seller's willingness to compensate buyer's broker. I truly can't understand how this is going to work. I mean, I understand why it's here, but this is one of those things that's going to shake out by the end of the year, I promise you, right? And whether or not this will remain just as this is, in this form remains to be seen. So an authorizer doesn't authorize. So because that's one of those, one of those questions now that we're going to be asking the listing agents when we have a buyer that's interested in a property. We call them and ask them all kinds of things anyway. Hey, do you have any other offers working on this? How can we accommodate the seller's preferred closing date if your buyer has any flexibility in that? Now, one of the other questions that we're going to have to ask is, has your seller indicated that they're willing to pay the buyer's broker's compensation? And if the answer to that is, I'm not authorized to disclose, I don't know what that means. Okay, well, we're going to be asking for it in the contract anyway. So,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
All right. So, okay.
Yeah. You have to disclose it, right? I don't know. Okay.
Again, I guess I understand why some people wanted it in there, but we'll see how it all shakes out. Okay. All right. On line 319, seller's not willing to compensate the broker assisting the buyer, right? And there is no authorized or not authorized to disclose that, right? So if the seller says, by gosh, no, I am not paying the person that's working against me in this contract, that's an opportunity for you to have that conversation, all right, again, about the making it attractive to all buyers, to as many buyers as possible. But absolutely, it's always the seller's, always has been the seller's decision to do that. Always has been. Again, that's kind of the thing there. So, and that would be something that would have to be disclosed when we make that call to that listing agent. On line 3, but for you on the listing agreement, realize that you have several options of boxes to choose here. Either 315 or 319 has to be checked, only one. And on 316, one of those two boxes has to be checked, but only one. Seller authorizes party handling the closing to pay compensation to broker from seller's proceeds at the closing. Seller understands and agrees that listing broker may be compensated by more than one party in the transaction. Again, the listing broker, not you as the designated agent, but the listing broker. If it's an in-house sale, then if Olgie sells, oh gosh, I maybe shouldn't do that because that's a team thing. So that's a whole thing. Just realize that. But if Autumn sells, because Autumn's joining me here on Zoom, if Autumn sells one of Laura Belt's listings, that's an in-house sale, and the broker is going to be compensated by two different parties there. So, all right, then we have our protection period. Again, there weren't any changes made to this protection period from our overviews document, but it is now named. And it's been put in the same paragraph that it was before, but it is a separate paragraph now named our protection period. Once again, just thumbnail explanation of that. If we have a listing and we have introduced buyers to that listing through open houses, phone call responses, that kind of thing, shown the property to buyers, and then you find out within a certain period of time, and the default here in the KCRIR form is 90 days. We have a blank. You can put in whatever you want to put in here, but our default is 90 days. So within 90 days, that buyer and seller get together and push you out of that the compensation is really what it is, what it boils down to, push you out of the contract after the listing expires. And you're no longer involved, and the seller thinks, oh, I don't owe them any commission. If it all happened within, and you find out about it within that 90-day period, yes, our compensation paragraph still applies. They still do owe us compensation. Again, the hoops that we jump through. Number one, we have to get a written list of all buyers to that seller before the listing expires. And then the other hoop, not really hoop, is that if the seller has listed with another broker, our protection period no longer applies. Okay, so, but, again, it could happen that, that listing expires. You had a buyer that comes through an open house. They answer your phone calls. You talk to them a couple of times after that, and then suddenly they quit returning your phone calls. And then after your listing expires, you drive by the house and you see a moving truck out in front, and the seller is out there in the front yard. So you stop and say, so I see you sold the property. And they happen to mention, oh yeah, it was to so-and-so. And you know that was someone that you showed the property to, that buyer that came through your open house. If you had given that seller a written list that included that buyer's name, you were still, and it's all within the 90 days or whatever days you arrange, then you're still due that compensation. All right, paragraph number 11 on line 338, the title insurance, there were some changes made here. Seller's been informed of seller's responsibility to provide the buyers of the property with evidence of clear title is required by the sales contract. Our contract does say that the seller is going to pay for it. Anything can be changed in a contract, but that is typically the way that we do things in Kansas City. Seller authorizes broker to order title evidence through. We would name the title company there. If the seller has a preferred, that's who we use. Otherwise, make sure you are giving at least 3 names. If you have a favorite one that you like to work with, then by all means, tell them why that's your favorite one. But don't put yourself in the position of just saying, oh, we're going to do it through XYZ title, because everybody gets in trouble when you do that. Line 341, property is vested in the names of, and so then invested in the names of. Although we have our sellers' names at the top in the header, let's clarify here. The header may have Sam and Sally Seller, a married couple. But if you find out then at some point through your conversations that it is in a trust, even though our tax records don't show that, this is where you would put that trust name there. There's a little more space for you to put it here, even though our header allows for that too, if you know it's a trust going into it. Make sure that you are asking, if Sam and Sally weren't married when the house was purchased, maybe only one of them bought it, maybe they bought it together, maybe they bought maybe one of their parents was on the sales contract at the time, all of those things. Make sure you're kind of asking those clarifying questions. And so here then the final sentence on line 343, the final part of that sentence, including but not limited to marital status of all of the parties, if there are any trust documents, if there's an LLC. I'll talk about this again on Wednesday, but if it's a trust, we don't necessarily need a copy of the trust, but the title company will. So a good time to mention it to Sam and Sally. If it's an LLC that currently owns the property, once again, we don't necessarily need a copy of those documents, but the title company will need evidence that Sam and Sally are the authorized signers for that LLC. So all those kinds of things. Nothing changed about the home warranty. Nothing really changed in the rest of our document. Very few changes, although there are major changes, but very few changes in our listing agreement. Once again, the brokerage name will go here on line 379, and I'm only going over this because It is the KCRAR form. Your brokerage name here, KWNKC Kansas City Metro is our preferred title there, LLC. And your name will be printed and but in our internal forms, that's already pre-printed there for you. Your name will go on line 382 as the designated agent assisting the seller, and all sellers have to sign, all owners of record need to sign. If they have an address other than the one that we're listing here, please include that. Please include the seller's phone number and email address so that the broker can contact them if need be. What else was I going to try to cover this morning? The real estate sales contract. Not many changes there, but a few major ones. If you've been playing with our contract, is why I wanted to go over this. Make that a little bigger for everyone here. All right, our residential sales contract. We are again, I'll go over this next week. We'll go through the contract again. But I wanted to just hit on the changes here. We'll get there. All right, first change shows up on lines 126 through 129. Unless identified as seller or buyer, listing a broker, and any cooperating broker and their agents collectively are referred to as broker, and any escrow or closing agent are acting as agents only and are not parties to this contract. Here's our change. Here's our addition. That part of that paragraph has always been there, but our change is here. Broker assisting the buyer shall be an express third-party beneficiary of the provisions of section 4.F4.1, paragraph F4, subparagraph F1 of this contract, and shall have a separate and independent right to enforce such provisions against the seller. Again, just to reiterate, the contract always has been, always will be between the buyer and the seller. We are not parties to the contract. We, however, this paragraph tries to make clear, are beneficiaries to something in the contract, the buyer broker compensation that we'll get to here pretty soon. So that's been added. Just again, make sure that all parties are aware of this. Make sure that in your thumbnail cheat sheet that you use, see, I'm telling you, it's applicable in all situations. Make sure that you're discussing that. Okay, it's the contract is not between the broker and any party, but we're a beneficiary to some of the terms within the contract. All right, here we are on page 4, paragraph number 4. I was so happy that they didn't change any of the page numbers for me. I'm so used to referring to page numbers, but some of the line numbers did change. I'll have to get used to that. So, all right, on line 206, seller compensation to, all right, everything else remaining the same up here. Our sales price, our earnest deposit, nothing about that changes. Additional earnest deposit, then because our form has to do things backwards for some reason, our amount financed, if it's a loan that the buyer's getting, the amount financed goes on line 196, and then on line 201 is the difference. It really boils down to the difference between the down payment minus the earnest deposit, right? It gets a little confusing the first few times you go through there. It's not real intuitive, but it does kind of make sense. Don't know why they feel the need to do it that way. So line 206, though, this is completely new, completely added, will be added to our contract, baked into our contract. Seller compensation to broker assisting the buyer. Seller agrees to pay broker assisting buyer from seller's funds at closing. It is not part of the closing costs. It is separate from. And again, if you are writing an offer before these forms actually get into use, and we will be given our drop dead date when we have to start using these forms. If you are writing an offer and on that MLS sheet, so far right now, they're still showing an MLS, any buyer agency or transaction broker compensation, and it's 0 or less than your buyer agency agreement calls for, this is the verbiage we want you to use. What's in that last part of, or the second sentence there. Seller agrees to pay broker assisting the buyer from seller's funds at closing. And if you're writing it in, you're going to, in a current contract, you're going to have to write the amount in as a percentage or as a flat fee. Same thing here on line 207. This can be a percentage, that can be a flat fee. Nobody cares. Once again, just to reiterate what's in all of our forms, it's not set by law, right? No one's telling anybody what to charge other than your agreement with your buyer. Then we still then have our seller pay closing costs, seller agreeing to pay closing costs of the buyer. And nothing about our closing and possession paragraph change, nothing changed about our appraised value contingency, that all remains the same. Sale contingency is the same, financing terms are all the same. Loan approval didn't change. Condition of the property, utilities, maintenance, our insurance casualty loss. We'll talk about all of these on next week when we're talking about the contract forms. Inspection paragraph didn't change.
We'll be able to print these off, so we can, like, I know we have like the new forms.
The training,
So I can make
yes,
those on-
yes, we can, yes,
Okay.
absolutely, yeah. Yeah, and again, yes, and I might encourage you to do that. If anyone wants copies of these, remember these, and it's, you know, all the watermark is there. It's only for training purposes. And there still may be some changes even before we start using them. Pretty sure, 100% sure that there are going to be changes by the end of the year. You know, as we are out here using them, the problems will arise, as they always do.
Only you have access to them now.
I think it can, well, yes, probably, yeah, I don't think Sam would have it, your team would have them, so yeah, I'll print them off.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay, sure, yes, and so, yeah, anyone out there in launch land that wants that.
Mhm.
Uh-huh. Okay, all right, Olgie wants it
Like
too.
I
All
wanna
right.
make like a cheat sheet, yeah,
Yeah.
like to like, you know, like right
Yes.
on there.
Yes, 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 yes. Absolutely. And, oh, all right, so thank you for pointing that out for me too, because I do have a cheat sheet for our current contracts,
Okay.
right?
Cool.
Of course. Which way, yes, and then once we get our we know that it's a final version of this, I'll redo that. But oh, sure, I will give you a cheat sheet of our current contract too. Oh my gosh,
That's
yeah.
like gold.
Gold. I would love
Well,
to
we
print it
can
and
charge
charge
for that.
Yeah, and the old. energy.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
do that, ouch, of course, right? Everybody out there wanting that, just let me know. Lead-based fee, criminal offenders didn't change, franchise disclosure, brokerage relationships, here we have some changes. This part of the contract didn't change. Kansas and Missouri both required that we disclose who's being represented, if they are, and by whom. So this has always been paragraph 20, page 13 of our contract. It's always kind of confused agents, not just new agents. I see contracts coming through from experienced agents that should know better. But I will say this too, some of the old experienced agents, you know, I would put myself in that category, that started selling long before buyer agency came into effect. Some of those agents still can't get all of this, can't get their head around all of this, can't get all of this straight. So I'm just going to say it here, we'll go over it again next week when we're doing contracts, but you will, for launch purposes, always be a designated agent. The only time that you will not be a designated agent or transaction broker, let me clarify that. Forget everything I just said, wipe that from the record. You will never be a seller's agent or a buyer's agent. Let me put it that way. The only time that will ever happen to you in your life is when you become a supervising broker. Right? Those are the only people that can be a seller's agent or buyer's agent. You will usually be a designated seller's agent or a designated buyer's agent. When coming from the point of view of writing this contract on behalf of a buyer, you will be the designated buyer's agent. You can also be, if you don't have an exclusive buyer agency agreement, you can also be a transaction broker. So that would be on line 699, what you might be disclosing. And if you are working as a transaction broker, you would check it on both sides. You're not representing either party, but you're the licensee assisting the buyer. If you're showing it for sale by owner, you're going to certainly check it on both sides. If you're showing it for sale by owner, then we also show on line 708 that the seller's not being represented. So lots of boxes that could be checked here. most of the time, you're going to be checking the designated buyer's agents box on line 6 on the right-hand side of line 697. And then another thing that changed about this form is some addition to the verbiage down here in this box below that box. On line 710, source of broker compensation. There are no standard compensation rates, and compensation is fully negotiable, not set by law. This part remains the same. We have another change later on in the paragraph. Brokerage fees to include but not limited to broker compensation and other fees will be paid out of escrow at closing as follows, unless otherwise described in the terms of the respective agency agreements or other seller-buyer agreements. And this was added. Seller and buyer acknowledge the brokerage involved in this transaction are acting pursuant to separate brokerage service agreements entered into with the seller and buyer respectively. Again, transparency, make it perfectly clear. All parties can be represented by someone else. We've just told you if they are and how they are. But those relationships have been established in agreements between that broker and that party. Seller and buyer acknowledge brokers may be compensated by more than one party in the transaction. Check all applicable boxes. Brokers are compensated by seller and or buyer. Chances are you're still going to be checking both of these boxes, just as you always have. Sometimes the seller may be the one that's dropped off this time. Signatures below only apply to the brokerage relationship disclosure. So at the bottom of this paragraph 20, everybody signs. You, all buyers, all sellers. All they are acknowledging is that these disclosures have been made to them. They're not, they are acknowledge the receipt of all of the other information throughout the contract, but signatures here are only acknowledging that they've received that information and agreed to it. And again, I'll say it next week, but when we're writing the offer on behalf of the buyer, make sure you've completed everything completely there and accurately. You never want your buyer to be signing anything that's not completed, and we want to be as accurate as possible. Yes, things can be changed in an amendment, but please just make sure before you get there. Marketability, expiration. So nothing else changed. So very few, but very important changes in our sales contract. All right, there we go. And our residential. And as our overview form told us, if you are selling new home construction or selling land, changes were made on those too, just different. They're in different places in the contract. Line numbers would be different. So everything else we'll be going over next week when we're writing the contract. Just remember that all buyers that want to be on title at this point in time will be signing on the deed at having title. We'll sign here. Make sure that you're completing everything on the right-hand side about you and your brokerage. Please, just as a nice thing to do and make your contract look nice and neat and tidy, and give the impression to the other agent that you will be a great agent to be working with, go ahead and fill in the brokerage and licensee information on the seller side too. Just like to make that point. And then also we'll talk about this next week as well, but this last paragraph, line numbers changed here on because they added some things throughout, but the form certification box is for you to sign as the licensee working with the buyer, assisting the buyer, but only after your buyers have initialed and signed all pages on this, because this is our certification that we can only use approved pre-printed forms. We only filled in blanks and no changes were made to that form unless it was initialed by all parties. So you can't certify that unless your buyers already signed it.
You send it to them, they sign. Once they sign, you sign.
Correct, right. Laura just clarified there. We filled in the offer, send it to the buyer, they sign up here, they sign page 13, they initial all other pages and sign here on page 16. Then when you get it back, you go through and make sure. In dot loop, they shouldn't have the ability to do anything. Oh, here, let me make this point too. You sign everywhere that you should on most forms before you send it to your buyers for signature. So you'll be signing page 13 also before you send it to your buyer. There's nothing for you to sign on this form other than that. before you get it back. So if they try to make a change on the form, it's going to clear your signature and you'll get that notification. Right? So you should just be making it can sign only when you send it to your buyers. Sometimes things kind of fall through and it can edit and sign or can fill and sign. And so if they do try to make a change on this, you will be notified because you'll have to sign it again. So just, but even with everything else being good and the way it's supposed to be, take a look through and make sure that there aren't any funny characters somewhere or that your signature hasn't been erased. Then you will sign this as the licensee preparing the form. All right, well, I actually got done a little quicker than I thought I would. Let's see if there was anything else that I felt the need to go over today. Oh yeah, the retainer. So we talked about the changes. No, well, I should do that. Yeah, maybe I'll have time for all of it. We will go over the retainer. This is a brand new form. We've never had anything like this before. So it's brand new form here. This addendum is part of an exclusive buyer agency contract or a non-exclusive buyer agency contract or a limited services transaction broker agreement dated, and then on any other form that's going to be the effective date of our contract, of our agreement there. And it's an agreement between the undersigned broker and the buyer. However, we are working with them. Retainer additional compensation. In addition to any compensation, commission, or fees due broker as stated in the above, that whatever agency agreement we have with them, buyer agrees to pay broker as partial compensation, now known as the retainer or additional compensation of. This is when we're going to be asking the buyer to prepay us for some reason. For whatever reason. On the buyer's side here, I think it's probably a good idea to have a conversation with the buyer, as wouldn't necessarily find, I know I'm not going to go there either, but working with any buyer under any agreement, you absolutely are entitled to ask them to prepay for some of your expenses. We're going to be spending time with them. You're going to have costs associated with them. For buyers, a lot of it is your time setting them up on searches and making those initial phone calls and setting the appointments and all of that, plus your gasoline expenses and your time showing them. So you're absolutely entitled here. We will have further conversations within our brokerage. And those of you on a team will have further conversations on your team, I'm sure, about, does your team do anything like this?
No.
Working with buyers I didn't think so. I think there is maybe a team in our brokerage that does, but I didn't think it was you. All right. For services rendered here, pardon?
Oh, no, I was just laughing.
Oh, okay. All right. For services rendered here under regardless of whether or not a property is acquired by the buyer. So this is just, buyer, I'm going to be spending a lot of time, money, and energy on you. I would appreciate some of that being paid up front. The retainer additional compensation will or will not be credited against any compensation owed to the broker for services rendered hereunder in the event a property is acquired by the buyer under the contract. One of those two boxes is going to have to be checked. Again, office policy may dictate what their preference is, but this brokerage gives all of the agents quite a bit of leeway in the decisions that they make. And so, it's probably going to be up to you there too. The retainer additional compensation shall be due and payable to broker on the effective date of this addendum. So I want it signed right now. And I want that money right as soon as we sign this, or within blank days after the effective date of the contract, allow the buyer to access money, send you Venmo, whatever that's going to be, or other, could be, that could be, then that would leave it open to being any time within the agreement. If you're going to do it, I would probably do it on some kind of a limited basis, but again, no right or wrong in any of those. That's why they're all there. Buyer acknowledges there are no standard compensation rates and the compensation is fully negotiable and not set by law. That's going to be along with our legal disclaimer down at the bottom in every agreement that we have. Brokers prohibited from receiving compensation for brokerage services that exceed the amount of compensation as stated in the contract and this addendum. And then our legal disclosure that's on all of our documents telling whoever's signing it, carefully read the terms hereof before signing. When signed by all parties, this document becomes part of a legally binding contract. If not understood, consult an attorney before signing. And you'll see who all needs to sign down here. The brokerage name, the broker. So send it to Lynn through .loop. You are going to be the licensee assisting the buyer, and then all buyers will sign then as well. Yes, still have a few minutes, so I will get back to those other two addenda. Well, that's not it. Oh, maybe I didn't pull them over here. I sure thought I did. All right, so instead, we'll talk about the seller's estimated proceeds worksheet, as I said earlier. Not much has changed on this on the KCRAR form. The one thing that is changed is that they now have a breakdown down here of potential buyer expenses. Or an addition, buyer's broker compensation here, added here, as an additional expense to the seller. And this is on the seller's estimated proceeds worksheet. I will tell you then, once again, if you are using, and it's fine to use the KCRAR forms. There's nothing wrong with using the KCRAR forms. And most of my trainings, though, I do try to make it clear that we have an internal form of this that David Conderman, the king of Excel spreadsheets, made for us a few years ago. It's available in our documents. I like it because I think the buyer, I know the sellers does, but I think the buyers, I know the sellers does, so I'll just stick with that, has a third column on it, so that when we are presenting this to the seller, as the broker requires that you do when you're taking the listing, seller, here's what we're going on the market for. Here's, maybe we're not going to get quite that much. The market may change. So here's another reasonable offer we may receive in column number 2. And then I use column number 3 as my worst case scenario. If something really drastic happens, right? So I like having the 3. There's not, again, I want to reiterate, there is nothing wrong with using the KCRAR forms. It has everything on there that you could need or want. I prefer having that third column when I'm making presentations to sellers. Then on David's form, on our internal form, one thing that David has always done is broken out the commission between what the listing broker retains and what they are sharing with the buyer, the broker assisting the buyer. So that's already kind of built into our form. So again, our new one is also going to have that broken out here separately. It's going to have on our broker's compensation up here on line 17, that actually should be highlighted, because that is just what they are paying us, what we are keeping. And then on line 24, that's been added, what they may expect when we're doing this, as we're taking the listing, what they may expect the buyer's broker or the buyer to ask for in the contract, or if in our listing agreement, they have already agreed to pay a certain amount, we put that here. Again, either way, that can be a percentage or it can be a flat fee. Nobody cares. That's a negotiable item between you, the seller, and the broker. And then in addition to all of the other buyer's closing costs, the seller may be paying. So that's the one thing that's changed there. And apparently I didn't bring over the other 2 forms that I thought I did, so I guess I'm done
Is
there.
that the in-house one supposed to be in Casey Metro form?
No, it's never been put in there because it's a live Excel worksheet. And that's why we don't have the ability to put calculating. So it's in our on the portal
Okay.
and under documents.
Okay.
Yeah, it's in there. Yes. And that's another reason why I really like to use our internal one. I think KCRAR has one that does calculations, but I can't remember. But our internal does all the calculations there for you. Plus David's added some cheat sheets in there for title costs and what PMI might be, all those kinds of things. So all kinds of little cheats on it. I really like.
Will you go over that or no?
I do. Last month I did, no, last month I did the resolution. So yeah, this month
All right.
sometime.
Become-
Yeah, I will,
become-
yes.
Okay.
I'll make sure that it goes out there, it's spread out there, but yes, we do go over buyer's estimated and seller's estimated worksheets in here. Yes, yes, yes. All right, so that's it. Everyone, I am finished with you for the day. I will see you on Wednesday. We will go more in depth in our listing agreements and buyer agency agreements. And I'll make sure that I have the amendments or addenda included on that. I'll have those for us to talk about on Wednesday. And if you have any questions, any of you watching this later on Facebook, try to make comments there. That way we know you've been watching it. If you have any questions, always reach out. Alicia says thank you. So goodbye, Alicia. We'll see you. I always respond to texts a lot quicker than I respond to emails. So 913-219-2289 is my cell phone number. Reach out to me with any questions or comments, and I'll see you all Wednesday. Bye.